Hello, everyone. I am joined today by Dr. Taylor Marshall, the author of the new book, Infiltration, the Plot to Destroy the Church from Within. Thanks so much for being with us, Taylor.
Yeah, good to be back with you.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about the book, the premise of the book. I mean, it's a kind of a provocative title, to say the least, The Plot to Destroy the Church from Within. And based on who you are, some people might get really excited about that title, and other people might roll their eyes, or other people might get really angry. But the one thing you're not going to do is read that title and just go your way without having any reaction whatsoever. So just tell us what's this? I mean, what's the main premise of this book?
Well, things, it's difficult to be a Catholic right now. I think everybody agrees on that point. And there's a lot of confusion in the church. And so there's a lot of theories on how we got here. Some people say, just support Pope Francis all the way, no questions. Other people say, man, we were doing really good, and then Benedict resigned, and it's confusing. Other people will say, if we can just go back to John Paul II. Others will say the problem was Vatican II. Others will say it was John the 23rd. I mean, just there's different places where you can point and lay the blame.
No, Vatican II wasn't fully implemented. That's the real problem.
Right, yeah. Vatican II is still not fully implemented. So, and I wanted to do a book showing that it's not a light switch, like all of a sudden in 1958 the lights went out, or in 2013, poof, everything went to pot. So in my research, I saw, especially as I've studied Vatican II and the Latin Mass and the liturgy and the Holy Week liturgies, I began to see, it's something that I kind of knew already and been told, but already in the 50s and in the 40s and in the 30s, you already had a lot of dissident theology, a lot of modernism, and a lot of rebellion against what had been very clear Catholic teaching for hundreds of years. And as I did more research and I looked into Fatima and then Our Lady of La Salette and the whole controversy about what's the valid message of Our Lady of La Salette, and then into the 1800s, I realized this isn't just like a decade or 50 years, 60 years. This is really 150 to 200 years story of an infiltration to bring the Catholic Church in conformity to what you might call like secular humanist ideals.
Yeah.
Right. And so from the time of Christ and the apostles and Nero up until the French Revolution and Napoleon, the strategy of the enemies of Christ was to attack the church from without.
Yeah.
Kill that holy person, kill that bishop. And then what do? We get the relics, we put them in an altar, and we build an enormous basilica, right? And
it never works, yeah.
Yeah, so Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And so in the 1800s, Pope Gregory and then Pius IX and Pope Leo XIII, they were aware of a plot to infiltrate, to attack the church, not like had been done before, but from within, through subtlety, through compromising priests, seminaries, religious orders, even the bishops. And this all began in around the 1840s. And that's where my book begins. It begins in the 1830s into the 1840s, and it traces it all the way up to Pope Francis and shows this long arch infiltration in the church with regard to morals, faith, secularism, liberalism, modernism, and so on. And so I think we're living now in sort of that flourishing of the infiltration, and it's important for people to see that this has been a long and deliberate process of the enemies of Christ and not something that just happened, like a flip.
Right, which is a really key point. So what was it about that time period? You said it goes back to like maybe the 1840s or something. What about that time period specifically hatched this plot to infiltrate the church? Who kicked it off? I mean, what were they thinking? Who came up with this scheme?
So if you like kind of position the whole thing in the beginning of the book, and if you think about 1517, Protestant Reformation, over the next 100 years, what we knew as Christendom is fractured and destroyed. It's all chopped up. And as you move into the 1600s and then you arrive into the 1700s, there is this sense in Europe that what we once had, what bound us all together, which was Christ and the Catholic Church, right, and an allegiance to the papacy, that's gone. And there's something in man that longs for something universal. We might say small c Catholic,
yes.
that unites us together. Even going back to the Tower of Babylon, right? There's this sense, right? And so instead of it being Catholic and sacramental and ecclesiological, instead it became secular and humanist.
Yeah.
And they formed secret societies to discuss these ideas. When you talk about Freemasons, people put on the tinfoil hats and they roll their eyes. But, just bracket that word and think of secret societies. In the 1700s, you couldn't go out and write an article or write a book and say, hey, we should overthrow the church, overthrow monarchy, overthrow the traditional family, institute what eventually becomes socialism and communism, right?
You can't say that drawn and quartered. Yeah, I mean
exactly. So what they did is they created secret societies, and in England it was known as, in Scotland, Freemasonry.
Sure.
In Italy it was the Carbonari. They have different names, but they're secret society of extremely intelligent men, secular men, humanist men, who want to bring together mankind in a common religion, rationality, a new world order. Right. This is language they used. And stress the brotherhood of man. All religions is equal. All of them are equally false and equally true. They're kind of like children drawing pictures of God. None of them actually are accurate, right? And we can bring mankind together in this great, Tower of Babel. It's really a satanic rebellion to take our human nature and try to expand it and elevate it to something that's divine, which is what the Tower of Babel is all about. This is why the Freemasonic secret societies were obsessed with the legends and myths of alchemy, because alchemy is taking base metals and through magic elevating them to gold. And so that's exactly what Lucifer did. He took his own nature, he rejected God's grace and God's glory, and he tried to elevate himself into a god. Right. So that's the satanic strategy, that's the satanic belief. And this is what the secret societies were doing in the 1700s, and they pushed it so far that the French Revolution happened at the end of the 1700s. It was successful for a little bit, but it failed. So moving into the 1800s is a new strategy. The secret societies are going to move forward, but they realize that it can't be violent, it can't be outward, it has to be subtle, it has to be more secretive, and it has to be persuasive. As the Carbonari said in Italy in the 1800s, primarily focused to the young people. They say don't even worry about the old people or the middle age. You can't get them. Yeah. Get the young people and get the clergy.
Yeah, and we're seeing the fruit of that today. So it's a really interesting point about becoming godlike almost, because you look at what's happening parallel to this kind of plot to institute this universal human brotherhood through reason and stuff. And likewise, you have this massive explosion technologically through the Industrial Revolution and things. And I heard someone say once, and I think it's a really profound statement, that science became kind of the substitute for magic. And many of the things that science accomplished were what magic had tried to accomplish for centuries, flying, or things like that, or manipulating nature and things like that.
Or what we're doing, which is projecting our voice and our images
over long distances. Exactly. So you see this attempt to exert our will over creation, and this desire to become godlike without grace. And it's like, we're promised to be partakers in the divine nature, but only through Christ, and only through the sacraments, and only through the church. And yet we reject that. And it's a very subtle distinction, it seems like, at first. It's same end goal, right? But two completely different ways of going about it. And it's like Cain and Abel, one offered strange fire and God rejected it. And so it's just fascinating to see where all this came from. But okay, so there's this plot to destroy the church. They decide to do that from within because they realize they can't destroy the church from without. I mean, the French Revolution, blood flowed in the streets, heads were lopped off, and they still couldn't destroy the church. So once this plot is hatched, how do they go about it? Where do they start?
Okay, so there's a document called The Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita.
That doesn't sound secret at all.
It was acquired probably maybe as early as the 1830s, 1840s. Pope Pius IX, when he became aware of it, he encouraged it to be published, as did Leo XIII. This was a document that was written under a pseudonym of the Little Tiger. The Alta Vendita is the high shop, the high sales place of the Carbonari, who were the secret society of Italy. They also wanted to overthrow the monarchy from within the papal states, and for them, the monarch was also the Pope. So they had a 2-for-1 vendetta, right? Get rid of the Pope and get rid of the monarch at the same time, who is the Pope. And in this document, it explains in detail how this will likely take a century, 100 years. We must go slow. We can't be aggressive. We can't be obvious. We have to focus on the youth. And we must, like St. Peter, cast our nets into the sacristies and into the seminaries and capture the clergy.
Yeah.
And it will be so it's not like, in 2019, you walk up to a cardinal like, hey, be on our side. What they want is for this cardinal to be born in 1940 and to go up through a more secular education, to go through a seminary that's been compromised with modernism. So by the time they're an ordained priest at 27, they're already sort of infected and infiltrated.
Right.
And then on and on and on and on until you get to our current time. And so the permanent instruction of Alta Vendita is attested. The entire document is in the appendix of my book. I go through all the juicy areas of that document and show that, in the early 1800s, there was a deliberate plan to undermine the church and even, as they say, gain a pope after their own heart. That is, after a secular humanist heart. And about that same time, you have the apparition of Our Lady of La Salette in France. There's two versions of Melanie's Secret, the 1851, the 1879. It gets kind of complicated. The book explains everything. But there again, we see prophesied an infiltration of the church. Mm-hmm. Secret societies, Paris will burn, and the trouble that will be placed on the Pope. So that's, we kind of have a document that we acquired. We have a supernatural apparition from Our Lady. After Pius IX, we go to Leo XIII. Leo XIII has this vision. The oldest, most attested account is that he had a vision of demons assembling on the city of Rome. Mm. And in response to that, he created the St. Michael prayer. And there's all kind of apocryphal legends about him being at Mass and
the saints. Go ahead.
Yeah, and he hears Christ and Satan talking, and how many years do you need? All that's apocryphal. I kind of show in the book that, these traditions are first found in the 1940s, so they're very late. I'm not saying they couldn't be true, but they're probably not true. But the oldest version of the story, which I believe is true, is just that Leo XIII had a vision or saw demons assembling on Rome. And so he wrote the St. Michael prayer. He said it had to be said by all priests, all churches throughout the world at the end of low mass every time. If you go to a Latin mass today, a low mass, you'll still hear it. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. He also wrote an exorcism, a St. Michael exorcism against Satan and the demons, to be recited by the bishops of the world and by priests. There are priests who still say it, but it's mostly been forgotten. So again, Leo XIII saw this infiltration, and then Pius X, the great St. Pius X, he realized that this humanism and the secularism and liberalism had come into the church and disguised itself under Catholic ideas and concepts and words, and he called it modernism, the heresy of modernism. Mm-hmm. And he struck out against it his whole pontificate. He was a real warrior against modernism. He saw that within the seminaries and the monasteries and even amongst the bishop, there had been a compromise in faith and morals. Mm-hmm. So, we're now 60 years, 50 years before Vatican II even begins.
Yeah.
Right. So the battle really goes back in time. I really hope when people read this book, they realize they can't just say, "Oh, Vatican II." The story is very complicated. And of course, Vatican II was them. It was a kind of a coming out party, and it was modernism on parade, and especially with the changes in the liturgy, and all that's covered in the book as well. But there's a long lead up to get there. You can't just change the church in 5 years.
Right. So, you talk about this concerted plot, beginning kind of in the 1840s. We're talking a lot of time here. This is almost 1840s. I mean, we're approaching almost 200 years. In 20 more years, we'll be at 200 years of this. Mm-hmm. So not only does this plot have to be, really well organized and thought out and executed, but it also has to continue over time. So
that's right.
It almost, but for things to continue for decades and generations, almost like this, it almost feels like there has to be a deep spiritual element that's fueling this.
That's right.
And would you say, I mean, obviously there's no document or anything to prove this, but would you say that, the Lord has allowed this for some reason? Because, it feels like Satan's been kind of unleashed against the church. I mean, the depth of the darkness that's kind of engulfed the Catholic Church, which really was the only force holding back kind of the tidal wave of evil in the world for centuries. For the Lord to allow this to happen, would you say there's a permission that's been given to Satan at this point?
Well, as Catholics, we believe that, there's the active will of God and the permissive will of God. For example, he actively wills for all men to be saved. He actively wills for us to go to Mass every Sunday, to be baptized, to not commit mortal sins. But he also, in his providence, because he honors free will and desires a loving response, permits things to happen, including Adam and Eve sinning, including Satan falling, right? So his divine plan, he permits things to happen, and surely he permitted this to happen.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's God. He could have stopped it. But for some reason in his wisdom, he has permitted this horrible thing to happen in the church. And, when you look at Our Lady of La Salette, you look at Our Lady of Fatima, it seems to me that there will be a great vindication of Christ and his church. And it seems at this time it'll be kind of like in the book of Esther. And Esther, the people of Israel were preserved on the 13th day. And I think that's why in Fatima you have Our Lady appearing on the 13th day of each month, repeatedly kind of emphasizing it. And I think we will see a glorious reign of Our Lady. In Fatima it says when, Russia is consecrated to our heart, there'll be a time of great peace. And so that's my suspicion. I can't, of course, prove it. It's speculation. But I think that our Lord is allowing this to happen, and he's allowing the serpent to come out of his hole so that his head gets smashed really good.
Yeah.
And, so that's, I don't put that in the book. That's just off the cuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Catholic gentleman special right there. But, yeah.
Yeah, bonus content. You get it right here.
Yeah, bonus content. Yeah.
But no, that's really awesome, actually, about Esther. I hadn't even thought of that before. But
look it up. Esther's 13th day. So I think there's a connection there. Because remember, in the book of Esther, which is a great book, everybody's got to read the whole Bible, but also read Esther, of course. If you haven't read the whole Bible, go back and read Esther. Is that, the enemies of Israel and the enemies of God are going to have all the Israelites killed and murdered.
Yeah.
And as the story goes on, the guy who's trying to murder them all, there's a flip in the story through Esther. And suddenly the king turns on the guy trying to kill all the Israelites because of Esther's intervention. Right? She goes into the court and intervenes, and there's this flip in the script, and then all the enemies of Israel, they're the ones that end up getting killed.
Yeah.
Right? So the whole story looks really, really, really bad, and then all of a sudden, wow, we were delivered, and it happens on this 13th day. That's why the Jews celebrate Purim, and it's on the 13th day. So I think that's why Fatima's on the 13th day, and there's hints there. I think we just have to be faithful, and no matter what happens, we stay true to what's always been taught in the Catholic Church.
Mhm.
We receive the sacraments. We love Christ. We love Our Lady, the saints, and we do our vocation, our duty. If you're a dad, be a great dad, husband,
Yeah, so that you kind of segued to my next question, which was a lot of people read this stuff and they're like, "Holy cow! Like this is bad. Like this runs deep. Like it just the light bulb goes
Yeah.
on and you
Yeah, everybody
realize."
reads this as like, it's way worse than I thought.
Yeah, right. So like
Right.
that's a really overwhelming revelation, maybe especially for someone who maybe thought everything's great in the church. I mean, new springtime, right? Like
New Pentecost.
yeah. So
Yeah.
if that's kind of been your mentality to this point, and then you read a book like this and you're just shaking your head in disbelief, that can really, if you don't approach it with the right attitude, could really be discouraging, push someone to the brink. Like, whoa. So, but it's not a despairing book. It's not a hopeless book by any means. So, two questions. One would be, what would you say to somebody who's like, this is so bad, like, I don't know what I could possibly do about it, I'm out of here. And second, like, for those Catholics who do want to stay faithful, what can we do? How can we do our part to kind of fight this great battle that we're engaged in?
I love that question because it's the last two chapters of the book, right? So the first is, well, this is horrible.
Yeah.
So I'm a Thomist. I love Thomas Aquinas. So I just laid out the cases. I was like, okay, let's look at all the non-Catholic responses and like put them in the best light. So one of them is become an atheist. Like, let's just say Christianity, it was a cool experiment. It was a great world religion. It kind of lived off the fumes of the Roman Empire, and it did a lot of good and got civilization kicked off. But come on, it's a joke. Let's get out of here. So that's one option. Yeah. And I explain why that's not a very good option. I think most people watching Catholic Gentlemen are not going to run off and choose option A for atheism. Then I say, another option is Eastern Orthodoxy. Right. You got bishops, sacraments, history, tradition, the Eucharist. But, they're like, for 1,000 years, the papacy's been whack. Right. And I think the papacy's whack, so I'm just going to join them. And I kind of have all the cool Catholic-y stuff without the Pope. Right. That's one option. Right. So I'm kind of doing the Thomistic thing of objection 1, objection 2, objection 3. Another one is be Protestant. Right. You still love Jesus. You believe in Jesus. He rose from the dead. It's you, Jesus, and the Bible.
Hey, if you want some beautiful liturgies, go to Episcopal churches. I mean, they got some nice ones. Yeah.
I was an Episcopalian priest before I became Catholic. So I could hop right back into that. No problem, right? Right. So, you can do that route. And then I start getting a little bit closer to home. I say, well, you could become a sedevacantist. It's real popular right now. Go on Twitter. All these young guys are jumping over on the Sede train and just say, hey, 1958, there wasn't a pope after that. And we're just sort of in limbo right now. And there hasn't been a pope for 60 years, 61 years now. And that's an option. I mean, you get rid of Vatican II. You get rid of any pope you don't like, Pope Francis, Benedict, John Paul II, John Paul I, Paul VI, John the 23rd. Just sort of, sweep it clean. Yeah. Another option is to say, is the resignationist, or they call themselves the Benny-Plenists. Benedict's still the pope. Francis isn't the pope, right? That's another option. And I go through all these and explain why I think they're wrong. I don't want to do that here on the show. It'll take an hour. And then I come to what I think is the proper response, and it's been called the recognize and resist response. Yeah. It comes from Galatians, where Paul says, when I saw that Peter wasn't walking in accord with the gospel, I resisted him to his face. And in the Vulgate, it's the word resist. Yeah. So you recognize the Pope for who he is. You recognize the church. You recognize, the visible institution. But where there is a compromise or a sexual scandal or immorality or problems in the canon law or tweets or airplane statements or whatever else, in those places you say, no, I resist that. Yeah. I don't accept that. I resist that. And so that's my position. I think that's the position of, guys like Cardinal Burke and Bishop Athanasius Schneider, who wrote the foreword to Infiltration. And I think moving forward, that's the best, the most biblical, and the most Catholic position that we have. So I would say, just because there's bad things, you can recognize still the truth of the institution, but resist it in certain elements. And then, what are we who aren't leaving going to do? That was the second question, right? Right. I make a comparison to when the Jews came back from the Babylonian exile. So, the Israelites had been fornicating and worshiping idols and sacrificing their children to Moloch. And God, through the prophet, said, God, I'm your husband. You're my wife. You've been adulterous. You've been unfaithful. Retribution's coming. There's going to be a punishment. And the Babylonians came in and they destroyed the temple. They destroyed Jerusalem. They tore down the walls and they enslaved the Jewish people, took them to Babylon. That's how Esther ends up in Persia, right?
Right.
Is because of this whole thing. But when they come back, they have to rebuild. Yeah. They still have their identity. They're still the people of Israel. And they need the temple. They need the liturgy. They need a wall. I know our current pope doesn't like walls, but they needed a wall. So the book of Nehemiah is all about building that wall.
Yeah.
But the enemies of Israel are raiding them and trying to and keep them from building. And so what they do is they have half the people building the wall, and they have a sword on their thigh as they build. And then the other half are standing there with weapons guarding them so they can get the job done. So when invaders come, they can fight them off and keep building the city. And I think I like that image because it's one of building and of defense, but also offense.
Yes.
And it shows us that we need to be defensive and build the wall. We have to rebuild the wall. We also have to rebuild the temple, the liturgy, and return to the original liturgy we had. But we also need to cover each other. So I kind of think of like the priests and the religious, they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting, building the wall. We need to be there with weapons protecting them. Mm-hmm. And those weapons are sacred scripture, sword of the spirit, the rosary, fasting, abstinence, keeping Advent and Lent ascetic and not just giving up chocolate or a piece of candy, right? It should be striving. Lent should be striving to enter the narrow gate, not just, something weak. Right. Like if being a Catholic doesn't cost us, it doesn't make us tired. There's not a sense of sometimes of exhaustion and, fighting for something that we truly believe in. We're probably not being Catholic the way our Lord said when he said, strive to enter the narrow gate. So if we think of ourselves as on the walls, rebuilding, weapons, being attacked, and then just thinking, we got to keep those vigils. We've got to, catechize our children in the traditional forms of piety. We have to rebuild the liturgy. We have to rebuild reverence, all these things, and we have to be armed while we do it. So that's the end of the book. I kind of gave it away, but that's, I think, the model that we as Catholics need to do as we rebuild. Like, things have been thrown down to the ground. I think once you read this book, you're like, wow, this has been pretty bad time for 100 years, especially in the last 50, 60 years. So, but we can rebuild. Like, the Israelites didn't just, put their hand on their head and walk off.
Right.
They picked up the shovel, they picked up the brick, they picked up the sword, and they said, let's build it.
And that's one thing I'm thankful for with my Protestant background is all those Old Testament stories that I was familiarized with. And so many Catholics have no idea about these stories, but the whole story of the nation of Israel is just one, just defeat and falling into sin, and then recovery and restoration. And honestly, that parallels the history of the church to a great degree. I mean, we just had the feast of Saint Joan of Arc, and she was killed by the church, for crying out loud. I mean,
she died. Listen to this. She died excommunicated.
Yeah,
she died under excommunication, and she's a saint.
Yeah,
we persecute our own.
So yeah, but this is a time, in a sense, when the lines are more clearly drawn than they've ever been. And the time, just think about, let's say you lived in, pick your era, the golden era, the 1950s. Let's say that you think that was the time.
Well, I would pick 1300 or 1200.
Yeah, I would too, but a lot of people pine for the 50s, or whatever.
Okay. Well, everybody says we pine for the 50s, but none of us really do. But okay, 1950s.
But let's say that's your perfect time.
Right.
Well, okay, how easy would it be to be a complacent Christian then? You go to Mass, you do your thing, you live your kind of Catholic life, and there's really, there's no challenge there. And yet we live in times when when it's it's either on fire Catholicism or it's not, and I think there's something beautiful about that. When
there's a gift in that.
Yeah.
There's a gift. I mean, we have to strive a little bit harder. It's just like Ezra and Nehemiah. They could have thought to themselves, 100 years ago, that was Solomon's temple.
Right.
And you could have just walked up any time of day and worshiped there and said a prayer. Now we're in the rubble and there's people trying to attack us. So we can't already have any time to pray. We've got to somehow rebuild it. It's not even going to be as pretty as the Solomon one. Yeah. Right. But we've got to do something. I mean, that in a sense is a grace to live in a time of downfall, because it does, like you said, draw the lines.
Yeah. And this is times like these when saints are made. I really believe that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, people look back and they'll say, these were the saints that rose up and fought for the faith. Yeah,
like Francis died in 1226. Maybe 500 years from now, if our Lord didn't go back to back, I don't want to go back to the 2000s, man. That's when Sam Guzman, man, he was on the earth at that time. He was such a great saint, like maybe this is the time when new saints are forged. Maybe people will look back to this century as a century of illumination.
So let's not waste these moments. But so the book, I mean, this is kind of an obvious question these days, but where can you get it?
So I can get it at Catholic bookstores. It's published by Sophia Institute Press, so you can order it. Sophia Institute. The book came out today. And people who ordered it from Sophia, I think, received it several days early. Amazon is backed up right now. It's saying like it ships in 1 month. That's not true. It'll ship next week. I think they're just getting everything stocked. Right.
Yeah, that happened to me too.
Yeah, that happened. So Amazon or a Catholic bookstore, they all carry it. So
I mean, this book is insanely popular considering the topic matter.
I've been a little bit overwhelmed. I mean, it's been number one in Catholicism, the whole category Catholicism, and it's holding number one in I think four to six other categories. And
well, it's at number 200 on all of Amazon. So
yeah, it was. The publisher told me it got down in the 140s a couple days ago. So I mean.
You'll be up there with Oprah before you know it.
I know. I mean, top 100 is Oprah country. Not that it matters that much, but
no.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason the book is so it's way popular than I expected, and I think it's because it's the first book to do an academic treatment with footnotes, with research, with history, and it's answering a question that people have been asking themselves ever since the Summer of Shame.
Yep.
How did Theodore McCarrick get to where he was?
Right.
Why are the bishops silent? Why is the Pope saying these things? How did the Pope get elected? Why did Benedict XVI resign?
Right.
Was Vatican II good or bad?
Right.
Should I go to the Latin Mass or not? These questions in the last 9 months have been amplified. I don't know if you felt it where you live, but it seems in the Catholic Church, these questions, it was sort of like fringe 5 years ago to talk like this.
Right.
But now you hear it in the narthex everywhere. And so this is the first book to come with a researched, responsible, I mean, this is not tinfoil hat. Like if there's not something substantiated, I leave it out of the book.
Yeah.
You're going to find, I mean, if you read reviews, everyone's like, there's footnotes, it's researched. I'm thankful for this. So I think it's a very calm and responsible account that takes in a lot more data than anyone expected. And I think when you read it, you see, okay, this makes a lot of sense. This is a bird's eye view, as opposed, like you go to a lot of trad websites and they have a lot of good info, but it's a little bit more myopic. And this is a macro view. It's a meta narrative over a long time. And I think people like to see the story. It's kind of like a historical treatment, like a documentary.
Sure.
Decade after decade after decade, and you can kind of just feel yourself going downhill every decade as you read the book.
Yeah. So, I mean, is this for just the typical Catholic in the pew, or is this only for traditionalists? I mean,
oh no, this is Catholic in the pew. Yeah, this is. I mean, yes, it has conclusions that would run parallel with what traditional Catholics would say, but I think the majority of the people reading this book and getting excited about it are probably not traditionalists.
Right. Yeah,
So-
I think there's just it's like, you know, you go to the doctor and you've had a stomach ache for 6 weeks, and he finally tells you, well, you know, you've got this virus, and in
Right.
one sense
Or
it's uncomfortable.
you're allergic to a certain kind of food. And you're
Right.
like, oh, every time I eat pasta, I feel this way.
Right, and in one
it's like-
sense it's uncomfortable, but on the
Yeah.
other hand, it's refreshing because you finally can name the disease, and then you can do something about it. And I think that's why this book has taken off like wildfire. So thank you for writing it.
Yeah, I look forward to you reading it. Hopefully you have a good response to it. I think you'll like it.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate it. Infiltration, the plot to destroy the church from within. Thanks so much, Dr. Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. God bless.
You too.